Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Work in Progress, the Personal Productivity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. Let's get started. Hi everyone, and welcome to Bouncing Back. I am your host Tia Harmer, and today I am joined by Elliot D. Cohen, President of the Logic-Based Therapy and Consultation Institute and Executive Director of the National Philosophical Counselling Association. Today's topic addresses perfectionism and how it affects our productivity. Let's get started. Hi Elliot, how are you?
I'm very good. It's great to be here. Let me tell you some things about myself so that the audience can get acquainted with me. I'm a philosopher by training. I have a PhD in philosophy from Brown University. I'm one of the principal founders of philosophical counseling in the United States. So, what is
Oh, wow.
philosophical counseling? Well, it's helping people to solve problems of ordinary life by using philosophy. I'm one of those philosophers who believe that philosophy can be very practical and useful, and that's what philosophical counseling is. It's applied philosophy, and so one of those pioneers of applied philosophy who believe that philosophy can make a difference in people's lives, and so my work largely hinges around that motif, that concept.
So, we're now going to go into the part of the show where we get to know the guest. So, this is the part where I'm going to ask Elliot some questions just to get to know him on a more personal level for the listeners. So, our first question is, what is a recent book you have read?
Well, the most recent book that I've read is a book by Irv Yalom, a psychologist, and it's on group therapy, the theory and
Oh,
practice
wow.
of it. It's a very large book. It's about 600 pages
Oh, my
in
goodness.
length, and it but it's an interesting work on group therapy.
No, that sounds fascinating. Very long, though. That's
Very
quite a,
long-winded
yes.
author, yeah.
That's quite a mission you've given yourself there. And my second question is, what is a movie you would recommend?
I recently saw the movie Elvis, and it was very, very poignant.
Mm.
I grew to hate Tom Hanks in it because he was so good. He
Yeah.
was so good at his manager, and
Mm.
he was such a bad person that it was
Oh,
it was hard
definitely.
not to dislike him. But
Yeah, Tom Hanks does a wonderful job, in depicting the Colonel and just seeing how he operates as Elvis's manager. I highly recommend for those who don't know, Baz Luhrmann brought out the Elvis movie a couple months ago now. I think it was in June.
Mhm.
And yeah, now you can watch it on all streaming platforms and all those kinds of things. But yes, definitely recommend. It is such an incredible movie. It does go for quite a while. I think it goes for 2.5 hours. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, it's a long movie.
it is a long movie, which is very typical of Baz Luhrmann's style, but highly, highly recommend. So definitely go see that one if you haven't seen it. And my next question is, what is your favorite podcast if you have one?
I do a lot of podcasts myself. I don't really have a podcast that I would say is my favorite, but I've done a number of podcasts, and a very memorable one that I've done and I guess it was one of my favorites. I don't think it's on anymore, but
Mm.
it was Michael Edelstein, who's a
Ooh.
psychologist. He had a podcast on Albert Ellis's rational motive behavior therapy,
Oh, wow.
and uh, I was a guest on it some few times, and I really enjoyed working with Michael. Michael was a one of the uh, supervisors and trainers at the Albert Ellis Institute in New York City,
Oh, wow.
and so he's one of the old timers,
One of the
in
originals.
psychology,
Yeah.
and I enjoyed his presentations immensely.
Oh, that's amazing. That sounds fascinating. What was that one called?
Um, 3 minute therapy, and then it was on rational motor behavior therapy.
Mm. Oh, fascinating. That
I don't know
sounds.
the exact title of it, but that's
We can do some searching. We can do some searching. We'll try and put that
you
one in
got
the
enough to
description.
Google. You got
Yeah,
enough to Google on it.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And my fourth question is, who is your famous role model? If you have one, not everybody does.
I do, and this is a nice, easy transition from the Edelstein podcast to Albert Ellis, who was my mentor as well,
Oh,
and
wow.
he and Ellis was the founder of cognitive behavior therapy,
Mm.
and so he's a major figure in the areas of psychology,
Yeah, wow.
and was at a point in my life where I had lost my father, and I had uh, come upon his work, and then he sort of took me under his wing as his sort of philosopher on call.
Mm.
He filled a lot of seats there for me in my life,
Yeah.
and I learned a good deal from him, and he supported my work immensely, and so I owe him a great deal
Oh,
of
wow.
gratitude. In fact, when I visited him last when he was dying, I told him that I would, continue his work in my own philosophical way,
Mm.
through what I
Yeah.
call logic-based therapy, which is a
Oh, that's
version of
beautiful.
rational motive behavior therapy.
Mm. That's amazing. And
Yeah.
yeah, that's such a gorgeous connection that you have to someone who is your role model. That's, yeah, so beautiful.
Mhm.
And my fifth question is a course you have completed. Doesn't have to be recent, it can be at any point in your life.
Well, this course is very recent
Okay.
because I've recently gone back to earn another degree
Oh, wow.
in clinical social work, and I took a course that's I took a number of courses so far, but one of the courses that's I thought was quite useful is a course on research methods, and so
Sounds useful.
I'm taking some courses now on uh, politics, essentially,
Oh, wow.
policy and
Mm.
in social work, as well as a course in group therapy as well. And
That
that's
sounds
where I
fascinating.
got to read the Allen book, by the way.
Yeah, right. That's how that connects. That sounds so fascinating. No, you're definitely yeah, very in deep in your field, which is so wonderful to hear. So, as I already mentioned today, we are discussing perfectionism and how that affects our personal productivity and how to overcome it as a boundary when it comes to productivity. So, for our listeners, Elliot, how would you define personal productivity?
Well, I think there's a number of bullet points that I would lay down on that. One is the ability to multitask while doing a reasonable job,
Mm,
meeting deadlines, and doing excellent work. And when you think, some people say, "Well, I'm not a good multitasker," but when you think about, balancing your personal life with your professional life, you're multitasking, and being able, to coordinate, those balls in the air, so to speak,
Yeah.
so that you keep them reasonably up in the air,
Yeah.
and you're able to deal with the different the vicissitudes of life as they arise. That's very important. Another thing is doing things that I regard, from my own perspective here, or from anybody's perspective who's really interested in personal productivity,
Mm.
that you regard as something that you have a passion for, something
Yeah.
that you think is important.
Mm.
And so I think that when you think of productivity, you don't think of trivial things, that you're doing, but just something that's really meaningful, something that's important.
Yeah.
If you're defining your productivity in terms of something you really don't care about, then there's actually a problem there.
Exactly,
um,
exactly.
Changing my life now and then too, shaking up things,
Mm.
so that I focus on doing different things at different times, so that I keep the flame burning. And
Mm.
so I like to, do things like now I'm doing the social work thing, and sometimes I've had rendezvous in freelance journalism. I've
Yeah,
written books
wow.
on
Oh, cool.
politics and a number of different controversial issues and so forth. And when I get
Yeah.
tired of that, I sort of move on. But so um, there's one thing that I think there's a common denominator in these things. However, so I try to build on my knowledge and skills base.
Mm.
So I don't do something that's completely, different. And it's probably pretty hard to find actually things that are
Yeah.
totally different if you can't use your skill base. But I look for continuity. So when I do
Mm.
something else, there's always a connection with something I did previously. So, like
Mm.
my master's degree in clinical social work utilizes my prior work in philosophical counseling and clinical ethics.
Yeah. Yeah, wow.
See,
Oh my goodness.
yeah,
Yes, that is being productive.
um, yeah. So I'm continually evolving, and I think that's the idea of productivity. It isn't you've done one project, you're productive, but you're constantly moving forward,
Mm, mm.
in evolving and doing different things and seeing new connections and so forth. So that's really what I've come away with, in my career, so
Definitely. So,
far.
on that note, sort of, how do you think perfectionism influences an individual's personal productivity? Or before we even get to that, how would you define perfectionism? Because I think it's something that we need to understand and not have sort of misconceived before we dive into it. So, how would you define it?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. And there's actually two senses of perfectionism. And I've done a good deal of work. I've written a book recently on perfectionism,
Oh,
making
wow.
peace with perfection. Imperfection, rather. And there's two senses of perfectionism that I distinguish in that book and elsewhere. One is what I call aspirational perfectionism, and it's quite adaptive. So it's okay to be an aspirational perfectionist. And what does that mean? Well, you're constantly aspiring to be perfect. You're shooting for the stars, attempting to become better and better at what you do,
Mm,
realizing that there's no limit to how good you can get. But if you mess up or you fail to accomplish your immediate goal, you're still cool about it.
yeah.
It isn't like it's doom and gloom. Okay,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, there's what I call demanding perfectionism, which is maladaptive. And you
Mm,
demand no
okay.
less than perfection in whatever you do, or at least some things like your job, sports, school. In this sense, making a mistake is a sign of being a failure, a weakness, some form of ineptitude. If others disappoint your perfectionistic expectations, you may likewise see them as incompetent, stupid, a loser,
Mm,
otherwise, deficient. And for some perfectionists like this, if things don't go their way, the world is a sucky place, or just not one that really passes muster. So, in this sense of perfectionism, you demand perfection, and I kind of italicized the word demand.
Yeah.
You demand it of yourself, others, or the world,
Mm.
or some part of it. And as a result of that, you live in this perpetual state of emotional stress.
Yeah.
So that's the maladaptive form of perfectionism.
Interesting. So, how do you think, to sort of going back to that question, how do you think perfectionism influences our individual productivity?
Well, the maladaptive form here uh, thwarts productivity. All right, and it does that by creating a very high level of emotional stress. It can lead to burnout. You give up, you feel unworthy. And then what happens is a self fulfilled prophecy can take over where you let yourself, you know, fail. You set yourself up essentially for
Mm.
failure. So
Interesting.
that's the bad news philosophy to not take up. But unfortunately, it's a chronic problem for many of us.
Definitely. So, let's talk about sort of the difference between perfectionism and having high standards, because having high standards is different because it's more empathetic and kind of accepts flaws a little bit more.
Mhm.
So, what advice do you have for individuals who want to create goals of high standards but still avoid perfectionism at the same time?
One thing I would say is don't set goals that are impossible or unlikely,
Mm.
and then demand that you achieve them. You could set goals that are impossible or unlikely, but just don't demand that you achieve them.
Yeah.
See, so you can shoot for the stars. The sky's the limit. That's okay, but be realistic about possible outcomes.
Mm.
Say so you can't say to yourself, "Well, you set yourself up for failure," and then when you fail, you say, "Well, you know, I told myself, I'm worthless." So you can actually go through this kind of cycle of proving your unworthiness,
Mm.
by creating standards that you can't achieve, and that's a recipe for burnout for sure.
Definitely.
Be humble in the face of uncertainty.
Yeah.
Okay, and remembering that it's not about certainty really, but it's really about increasing probabilities. The world is
Okay.
based on probabilities. What you do is based on probabilities. But if
Mm.
you demand certainty, it must work. It has to work, and I emphasize the must. Or it should, it must. And if it doesn't, then all hell breaks loose.
Mm.
If you're a demanding perfectionist. But realizing that the world is based on probabilities. That there isn't anything very interesting going on in this world that isn't based on probabilities.
Exactly. No, definitely. Yeah. And I think that's great advice. I think we're so prone to setting these goals and sort of these standard for ourselves that aren't achievable. So, not all types of perfectionism are harmful, though. Adaptive perfectionism, like we talked about, can be beneficial, whilst maladaptive perfectionism, on the other hand, is problematic. So, how can a person identify if their perfectionistic behavior is starting to get problematic? What are the red flags that people can sort of point out to themselves that they know that signifies to them sort of when perfectionism is starting to become a problem?
Well, the maladaptive, that is the demanding form of perfectionism that we've been talking about,
Mm.
generates a lot of emotional stress, including anger, debilitating guilt, depression, and anxiety. And these emotions, in turn, take their toll on relationships with others, both, whether it's in the home or it's in the workplace. So really, red flags are, to ask yourself, are you getting angry, feeling down, guilty, or exceptionally anxious? Are your relationships with others, your colleagues, your workmates, family, friends, so
Mm.
forth, suffering? If you could actually say, yeah, really, I'm, getting into these scuffles, and I feel overly stressed about things. That could be a sign. I mean, it's not necessarily the case that that's the reason. Okay, I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of other conceivable reasons why somebody, is stressed, including physiological reasons. Okay, but very often those, are the signs. Anger. Are you getting angry too often? Is this unlike you? To get so impatient.
Mm.
With individuals. Um, are you really having problems with relationships that you hadn't had problems with before? These are red flags. So relationships and emotions, which go
Yeah.
hand in hand.
Yeah. would that be would that be classed as burnout, or does that mean something else?
Yeah, I mean that is a sign that you're heading towards burnout because demanding perfectionism is associated, and there's been empirical studies that show this, that uh, that type of perfectionism is associated with burnout, where you just lose your vitality, you lose your interest, you're just there,
Mm.
and you're
Yeah.
fulfilling your job. I mean, I spent the past 8 months. I worked as a clinical ethicist in two hospitals, and
Oh
I was
wow.
seeing patients and I was working with staff and so forth. And one of the things that we talked a lot about was the effects of the COVID
Mm.
pandemic, on healthcare workers
Yeah.
and the
Yeah,
problems.
wow.
And every one of them that I spoke to said, that they've wrestled, with this problem, trying to stay afloat,
Mm.
and perfectionism came up. That's really the a problem, that people have, with respect to high stress situations. If you're demanding perfection and treating patients, for instance, and you're not getting it, because it's not to be had, and you're in that situation where things are getting worse and worse, and things are so bleak, and you can't, kind of departmentalize and see that
Mm.
relative to the situation, you're doing okay.
Yeah.
And you have to say, no, this, I must,
Mm.
save the patient, or I must, be um, extra special here beyond, simply accepting, the limits of reality. Then you're in trouble. You see, and I've seen a lot of that, in my
Mm.
career, working with people,
Definitely.
particularly too in the healthcare professions, which I've done
Mm.
a lot of over the course of my life.
Yeah, definitely. So, what advice do you have for people who are sort of feeling this way? They're feeling like they've kind of reached their limit. They can't maintain sort of those standards for themselves that they would usually maintain. What advice do you have for people? Like, how can someone who struggles with perfectionism sort of step back and, tell themselves that, it's okay that I don't achieve these unrealistic goals? Sort of, how are people supposed to go about kind of diffusing their perfectionism?
So how do you overcome it,
Yeah.
essentially? Yeah. Well, give yourself permission to be a human being. So what is a human being? A human being is imperfect, right? I mean, we're not God,
Mm.
right? For those who are very religious, or believe in God, even believe in God, the only perfect being is God, but we're
Mm.
human. Okay, so we're not, we're not God.
Mm.
Accept your own fallibility and limitations and those of others. Another thing too that we can do, and by the way, full confession, full disclosure here. Um, I am what I call a recovering perfectionist. Okay, I have throughout my life
Mm.
demanded
Okay.
that I achieve
Mm.
perfection
Yeah.
in what I do, and I've worked on it for many years. I say recovering because it's just like alcoholism or any addiction. You're always prone to it.
Mm,
So if you
exactly.
tell yourself, no, I'm fine, I'm cured, then you're in trouble.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
got to be watching out.
Bit ignorant.
Yeah. So another thing here is to reframe failure or mistakes as a great opportunity to learn and grow stronger.
Mm,
That's really important, because if you start seeing your failures, I mentioned before about healthcare, for example. If you see your failures, you lose a patient or whatever. Um, as a failure, you're not going to see where you maybe could have learned something. So I always try to
interesting.
see, what when I've done something wrong, how I can benefit from it, how I can learn from it.
Mm,
And we have philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, for instance, who says that basically where you fall short, where you fail, that makes you to make you stronger. So he said suffering ignobles, meaning that when you're down and out in some ways, when you've fallen into situations that are difficult,
mm,
you can learn a good deal from those situations.
yes. Yeah.
See, and I think that's very important. Another is, don't expect the world to be perfect. You could try a broader perspective when things go wrong. So not everything is a catastrophe. I mean, there are individuals, and many of us who tend to catastrophize. See things as terrible, horrible, and awful. Where when you put it into perspective in the broader scope of things,
Mm,
you still have opportunities, you still have
yeah,
possibilities. It's not
definitely.
the end of the world.
Yeah.
Another idea here that's, I think, important is not to try to control what's beyond your control, such as other
Mm,
people's feelings, actions, thoughts, and their impressions of you. Instead, focus on what you can control. And what can you control? Well, you can control your actions, you control your emotions and your thoughts. You can't control other people's actions, emotions, and thoughts. You
mm,
can control yours.
exactly.
But as soon as you try to do others, then you're problematic. And there's a good quote from a Stoic philosopher by the name of Epictetus, who brings up this scenario. He says, imagine you're performing in front of a group of people. You're a musician and you're performing. If you focus on trying to control what the audience is going to say about you, uh, you're likely to mess up.
Yeah.
Okay. But if you focus on what you're doing, because that's where your power is, then you're fine. Okay.
Mm,
And the anxiety is generated by well, what happens if I fail? What are they going to say about me?
mm,
It isn't, actually the performance per se. The same person could be in their room practicing, and I'm a musician, so I can identify with Epictetus' statement.
yeah.
I've performed and I've made mistakes and stuff too, but just keep going, and
Yeah.
so nobody knows that you've made the mistakes.
Exactly.
But but the if you're telling yourself, what are people going to think of me, you're going to be very anxious. But if you give up that fear because you don't try to control, what people are going to think of you,
Mm,
you do much better.
mm,
You just do much better. I guess another
exactly.
thing I would say is be your authentic self. Don't
Mm,
base your self worth on what others think of you.
yep.
Instead, accept yourself, unconditionally. Not what others think of you, but what you know you as a person are always okay.
Mm,
So that's not a it's not, that's a constant. It's not a variable that keeps changing.
yeah. No,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you touched on an interesting point before in terms of, you were talking about the musician kind of analogy and how when you focus too much on what other people think of you, you're kind of going to mess up in a weird kind of way. So, high expectation perfectionists, demand the demand that they put on themselves can be emotionally draining, and they have to conserve their energies. And a lot of research has shown that, perfectionism overall, like you mentioned, is kind of counterproductive. So, that being said, how much, in your opinion, is somebody's productivity at stake if they continue to be a perfectionist?
Well, if they continue to be perfectionists, they're going to, ultimately sooner or later, they're going to meet shipwreck. I mean, and it might not be emotionally. Some people are very good, at sustaining high stress emotionally, so they live in this state of suspended stress
Mm,
because they demand perfection. And when you demand perfection, even if you're doing well, there's always a possibility that you fall from grace at some point in the future
mm,
because the future's unknown. So, there's always this constant stress. So if you can keep it up and live, why would you want to? But I mean, if you live in
yeah.
that suspended state of stress,
mm,
there's something that can happen, and it typically does, and that's it takes its toll on your physical health.
mm.
And there's lots of empirical studies, that show that demanding perfection can lead to various illnesses, anything from heart attacks, high blood pressure, colitis, um,
Oh, wow.
strokes,
My
and
goodness. Yeah.
even longevity has been linked.
Oh, my
Your
goodness.
lifespan
Mm,
has been linked, to this. Typically, people who live a long time aren't, perfectaholics. They don't put that kind of stress on themselves,
mm,
And there's an old analogy: if you took a hose of water and you just turned it on and left it on a building, just constantly pouring the water onto the building, what would happen to the building eventually? It would
well,
start to corrode,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, when you engage in demanding perfection, what happens is certain parts of your brain, the executive portion of your brain contacts your amygdala and your fight or flight system, and it's
Mm,
constantly going off. And what that system does, it pours a bunch of endocrine hormones into your bloodstream, and it doesn't give you a chance to settle down because it's constantly pouring it into you.
mm,
And what that does ultimately is it takes its toll, on your physical health.
yeah.
And so, my advice to someone who, is a perfectionist who demands perfection, even if you think it's somehow giving you a boost, which it really isn't, it's just putting you under stress that you don't need to perform. There's good stress and bad stress. The bad stress is where you put yourself in the state of demanding perfection,
Mm.
and that'll take its toll eventually, on your body in some way or another.
Yeah. No, yeah, definitely. And I think we've kind of seen the repercussions of that sort of post COVID. And there's this kind of people are really exhausted and tired and burnt out, and sort of, people in the health
Mhm.
sector and all these kind of things from having to sort of keep up with sort of how our lives were, but then adjusting to COVID and now going
Mhm.
back into it's kind of post COVID. I don't exactly know if we can kind of say that we've fully
Mhm.
overcome the pandemic yet, but sort of watching how sort of the pandemic affected people. Do you think that perfectionism sort of thrived in COVID, or do you think it's something that maybe put a lid on perfectionism and kind of told everyone, like, hey, you can't, be doing, perfect or being 100% all the time because it's just not viable?
Well, I think it created a lot of stress for people, and those people who were perfectionists had a harder time dealing with it. And so there was, more uh, anxiety and depression during 2020, especially 2021. there was a high incidence of anxiety and depression
Mm.
and mental illness during the COVID, the COVID crisis,
Yeah.
as we mentioned. And I mean, I believe that a lot of that, and I gather this from working with clients. I do, regular counseling with
Mm.
clients, and I believe that a lot of it, was due to the perfectionism, the demanding perfection. Very often, when I work with a client and I ask them, I work with them to formulate their belief system, to try to find out what their, major premises are that are creating problems in their life. Almost invariably, when they're depressed or anxious, there's some form of perfectionism going on. And during the COVID crisis, it was, really, really very lucid that was going on,
Mm.
based on, my clinical experience. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. So, going back to sort of this expectation that we put on ourselves. So, perfectionists tend to abide by this all or nothing thinking. If I haven't got 100 out of 100 on a test, then I've failed. And, it's that
Hmm.
very black or white thinking. There's sort of no gray zone in between, sort of, oh, I kind of did it, but not really. So, what
Hmm.
advice do you have for people to stop this form of dichotomous thinking and explore the other options that they might have?
Well, going to extremes tends to be irrational. So if you say I must be perfect or else I suck, well, here, my favorite, there's one of my favorite philosophers is Aristotle, and he would admonish us that the virtuous path typically lies in a mean between the extremes.
Mm.
In other words, neither extreme, just the moderation. Uh, so you're neither perfect nor do you suck. Instead, you're an imperfect person who has lots of positive potentials
Mm.
if you're willing to put in the work to actualize them.
Yeah.
But you'll never be 100% actualized, and that's very important proviso there. There's always room for growth, but
Mm.
that's what makes life really so exciting. So
Yeah.
imagine if whatever you did was perfect, that would be boring, wouldn't it? I mean, you'd have nothing really,
Exactly.
to be
Yeah.
desired.
Mm. No, definitely. And I think it's so interesting kind of looking at that in terms of, work expectations pre and post COVID. And I feel like there is almost, less of a pressure to kind of succeed in such a way. But I want to ask sort of when it comes to, particularly competitive professions. So, for example, when it comes to medicine or when it comes to law or those kind of academic fields, when those kind of fields are really competitive, how do people still strive for their best without falling into that realm of having to be a perfectionist? Because I know, like, I'm currently at law school, and the like pressure to get that perfect grade every time, and that pressure to be able to be 100% like the best of the best constantly is so overwhelming. And you see, so many law students as we get further on, you kind of burn out because nobody can kind of keep up with that pace. So, what advice do you have for people in professions who feel like to kind of succeed in their area of interest, they have to be a perfectionist?
I think that, you know, when you define yourself in terms of your profession, so that if I don't succeed in my profession, then there's nothing left of me. I am nothing.
Mm.
And that if you really see it that way, that I have to succeed as an attorney or as a physician because that's what I am. And if I fail, then I'm worthless. I'm unworthy. See, so it's that connection between demand for perfection, that is, I must never make a mistake, I must never fail, and if I do, then somehow I'm worthless. I'm just no good, you know. And that's, I think, happens to a lot of professionals, because
Mm.
and people who are, in school, trying to earn grades, and there's competition, that somehow uh, I have to get that grade. I must get it, otherwise I suck. I'm no good, and if you think of yourself as, almost entirely in terms of the profession that you're going into or you're in, then where are you? You see yourself as kind of in nowhere land, and as a
Mm.
nothing. And that's where, the catastrophizing comes in. Well, what am I going to do? My life is over. How horrible, how awful.
Yeah.
I can't stand it. See,
Yeah.
and they engage in what I call constipation, which you tell yourself you can't, and you refuse to let go of that can't. You hold on to it. I
Mm.
can't. I can't fail. I can't. No. And as a result, you create an incredible emotional stress. You don't, succeed as well as you could have otherwise done, often enough. And if you do,
Mm.
it's at the cost of creating, that kind of stress for yourself.
Yeah.
So essentially, there's a kind of lineage here. I must succeed in this field, otherwise I'm worthless. Therefore, I can't let that happen. You see the stages in that
Mm.
thought process. And once you say you can't let that happen, you know, if it does, then you've got this contradiction going on, and somehow life is over. It's horrible. It's awful. And
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
so watch your thinking is one of the things that I would say. Watch the identification of yourself with your profession to the point that you see that as your defining value. That
Mm.
you are your profession, and if you can't do well in that profession, you're nothing.
Mm.
That's bad news thinking. Not a good philosophy.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that provides us with a nice segue into our practice and habit experiment debrief. So, this is the part of the podcast where I'm going to ask Elliot sort of what he does to deal with the topic at hand. So, obviously, we're talking about perfectionism today. So, Elliot, what is the practice that you do to deal with perfectionism?
Okay, and I did give full disclosure that I am also, a recovering, as I said,
Yeah.
perfectionist. So this is appropriate for me to answer, since I've dealt with this issue as well as many others in the world. I'd
Mm.
say I did a study of about 2,000 students
Oh, wow.
at one point, and half of them were perfectionists, by according to the study, and there was about a little bit more females were demanded perfection than males, which
Mm.
is kind of interesting as to why gender might have something to do with it. And I don't know if it's statistically significant, because I'd like to repeat that study and see, but
Mm.
we can wonder, why so many people demand perfection. But in any event, what I try to do is bracket my work occasionally, and do it regularly. So this means not working at certain points, giving yourself some time to be away from what you're doing, in the work room. So what I do is arrange certain things that I do. For example, I enjoy watching movies on Netflix. That's how I got to see the Elvis movie. And
Yeah.
had I not done that, I wouldn't have been able to answer your question, because I wouldn't have watched any movies.
Yeah.
So I like doing that. I also enjoy playing my guitar and singing.
Oh, wow.
I'm an accomplished guitarist, and so the Epictetus analogy is one I can identify with. Um,
Yeah.
I find that relaxing. I also enjoy going for long walks.
Mm.
So I try practicing these activities instead of chastising myself for not working.
Yeah. So
And
kind of
I
like
think we
mindfulness.
need. Well, mindfulness is a very good activity. I do that actually in the course of everyday life,
Yeah.
and this is what I mean by that. You see, mindfulness teaches you to be an observer rather than an evaluator of thoughts. So you get a
Mm.
thought, if you're a demanding perfectionist, you have a thought that I fell down on the job, I didn't do a perfect job, how horrible, how awful, that means I'm a failure, and I can't stand this, and so forth. That's what mindfulness actually mindfulness meditative processes help you to avoid. So you turn out to be an observer. You
Yeah.
observe these thoughts and you gently push them out of your consciousness. So, one of the things is that, you take courses in mindfulness, they'll teach you how to have specific moments where you can do mindfulness meditation. And that's very good. Um, what I try to do is in everyday life, when I have situations where things are problematic, not what you want,
Mm.
um, I let the thoughts come to my mind and I don't evaluate. I observe them and let them pass away. And then when there's time, to think about these things logistically, if it presents a kind of issue that I have to resolve, then I'll do it. I'll think about
Yeah.
the logistics. I won't ruminate about it because worry doesn't do anything. It just creates more
Exactly.
stress. See,
Exactly.
but I think mindfulness can be done in everyday life.
Mm.
Not everything that people say is terrible, horrible, and awful. So you just observe things. You know, and a lot of times when people get really super angry, it's because they're saying to themselves, "How awful that they said this to me! How terrible! I'm going to tell them off." But if you
Yeah.
just listen, okay, and you let it kind of fade away, it goes bye bye. And then
Yeah, exactly. So, what would
yeah.
you say are three good things about this practice?
Well, with respect to taking this break from work and doing stuff that you really enjoy, and they can be engrossing and provide relaxation. They can also be cathartic. I mean, as I said when I was watching the Elvis movie, I really got engrossed in it, and it was very cathartic. Watching
Mm.
Elvis and
Oh,
really
definitely.
identifying with some of the stuff that he went through.
Mm.
As a recovering perfectionist, I know what it is to put long hours into work. I didn't take drugs to overcome it as Elvis did,
Yeah.
but you could understand what he was up against,
Mm.
and there's a catharsis there going on, so it's an emotional outlet. So I think it can provide an emotional outlet if you do stuff that's really interesting to you outside of your work.
Yeah.
Have hobbies, have other things that you do that you enjoy. They're accessible and you don't have to work to acquire them. For example, you just scroll through the movies and select one, or you lift up your guitar and start playing.
Yeah.
There's not work
Exactly.
involved in it. So those are three things that I would suggest.
So, would you say do you face any challenges when it comes to these practices?
Um, I think there are challenges when it comes to these practices, and the main challenge is that when you have a lot of balls in the air, that you're doing a lot of things,
Mm.
and you want to have that time, that me time, but you also have these pressures pushing you in different directions.
Yeah.
You know, you feel, you can feel that kind of pull, you know, that stress, if you allow it to. But you know, if you're strict enough and you say no, sorry, you know, this is my time, this is what I do. So you work at a reasonable schedule where you can schedule these things at a time that's, you know, that works for you. For example, I tend to do my social work assignments, which is very interesting. I write papers for these classes, and I think to myself, gee, this is very publishable, but it's just a paper that I'm handing in for a grade. And so I, you know, I do my assignments, you know, during the weekend, but you know, in the evenings I have time.
Mm.
You know, this done. I have a schedule. I know when it's done. I keep my schedule,
Yeah.
and then I do stuff, you know, that I enjoy. So Sunday evening, Saturday night, I can go out. I can watch a movie or whatever. But it's very important. It's. I think what a lot of perfectionists do is they say, no, it's just my profession. I'm sorry. It takes priority. It takes precedent over everything else. And if
Mm.
you do that, you're going to eventually feel that kind of overload, you know. So
Yeah.
you need some, you know, relaxing.
Mm. Definitely. So, how often do you usually do this? You sort of mentioned, like picking up your guitar or going for long walks or those kind of things. How often do you make use of these practices?
Well, my walks are 5 times a week,
Okay.
and that's, you know, that's good for your health,
Mm.
and it's good for your sanity.
Yeah, exactly.
And the movies, you know, if I could be doing something else, you know, sometimes there's other things besides movies I'll do as a
Mm.
social event or whatever. But if there's nothing other than nothing's that's also more interesting to do, I'll watch a movie like on a Saturday night or
Yeah. So, do
whatever.
you set up a certain time to do this, or you just kind of do it as you
Yeah,
feel?
yeah. I think having times and having schedules is very important for multitasking, which I mentioned is very important for productivity.
Mm.
And the thing is that schedules, you know, are not always carved in stone, and you know, and there are exigencies, things that come up that you don't expect, but then you get back on course. Okay. Now, a big problem is if you never get back on course because you just keep finding things that you have to do, and you just keep scuttling your, you know, your free time, you know, and trading it for work. It's self-defeating. You think you're going to be more productive, but you're not.
Yeah.
So scheduling is really important. Having a
Mm.
schedule and trying to stick to it as much as possible. Again, it's, you know, nothing's perfect. You know, even your schedule is subject
Exactly.
to some variations.
Exactly. Even the schedules aren't perfect. So, how do you think this practice would impact your personal productivity?
I think that I would probably be a lot less productive
Okay.
if I didn't, you know, do the sorts of things that I'm saying. That
Mm.
you need a personal life where you do things that you enjoy outside of your work. Um, I enjoy my work immensely. I'm, you know, dedicated to what I do. But even those who say that, it's still important to do other things, you
Yeah.
know, to do stuff that's different. Because as I mentioned, you know, with the idea of doing different things, even in your personal life, going on a vacation, you know, somewhere that you haven't been before, can be really revitalizing, because it's a monotony, you know, of things that can really get in the way of productivity. You know,
Mm.
everything's humdrum. It's same thing over and over again. No, you want to, you know, shake it up a bit. You know, it's
Yeah.
And your
Exactly.
professional life too. Like I said, I do stuff. At one point in my life that I didn't do in a previous part of my life. They're related to one another,
Mm.
but they're different. So I'm not burned out. I spent many years as a professor. And people were saying, "Well, you spent so many years as a professor. Well, are you still enjoy it?" Yeah, I do, because I did different things. I did different things in the classroom. I did different things in my personal life, and I'm still doing a lot of different things. I just
Mm.
spent 8 months as a clinical ethicist in hospitals working with patients. I've never done it. I've consulted with ethics, but I didn't do it heavy duty like that, where I had a patient,
Yeah.
who was on their deathbed and being consulted on a daily basis. I mean,
Mm.
that was a lot of stress, but I was able to handle it because I do the stuff that I'm doing. I mean, you need some release time. A colleague of mine said that he likes to use humor because what we're doing here is very you know you use the word morbid, but
Yeah, no, definitely.
it could get to be that. But if you take the approach where you don't allow it to become all you do, and you don't demand that everything go perfectly, otherwise it's all horrible, awful,
Mm.
terrible. And even in the stuff where you're dealing with death and dying, which is a lot of the stuff that I dealt with in South Florida, this
Yeah.
is a lot of people in advanced years in the hospitals, and that's a lot of the stuff we confronted.
Mm. No, definitely. So, based on your experience, which you've mentioned, do you have any other recommendations of practices to be combined or improved on with this practice?
Well, yeah, I mean, I mentioned that mindfulness is an important part of it. That
Mm.
when do when you release yourself from the stresses of everyday life by doing stuff other than your work, and the stresses of everyday life, well, whether it's your work life or your personal life. The reason why it's working is you're focusing on something that's not, you know, uh, immediate, something that's, potentially pressuring, you
Yeah.
know, and mindfulness can help, in that process. So even at work, see, you're not just reverberating with problems and evaluating them to the point that it drives you really stark raving mad. The goal here is to be able to kind of put things into perspective, kind of look at them, and sometimes just mindfully let them pass, let them go,
Yeah.
especially stuff that's not important.
Mm.
So in passing, somebody says something to you. Sometimes what happens is we hypothesize. Somebody, at work is not friendly today. What did I do? They must hate me. Well, another hypothesis is they're going through a problem in their life.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, you can, uh, think that way and then just let it pass, and then you avoid a lot of stress, and that stress can take its toll if it happens on a daily basis. So
Mm.
mindfulness activities in ray, I mean, in vivo, rather, I mean, when you're actually working, you can be mindful, you can let things pass,
No.
not evaluate them to death.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I think there's definitely things that you can do sort of very quickly, and they don't have to be, big, long, drawn out activities. I think they are definitely things that you can sort of do in the office, kind of on the fly, to help you, yeah, be more mindful of, you don't have to be perfect. We're imperfect humans, and just being able to have that mediation of trying your best. But if you don't always succeed, that's what I was trying to say. Then yeah, it's not the end of the world. Definitely no catastrophizing. So I'm going to go into some audience questions here. So I've got a question here that's asks, I grew up being a perfectionist, but now I'm in my 20s and I'm burnt out. I'm trying to put 100% into my uni and work, but I've lost that spark in me. How can I get that motivation back?
What did this individual say what they do as a job?
No, no, unfortunately, they haven't. They just sort of said that they're at uni and they work. And so they've kind of lost that spark. They're a bit burnt out.
Well, I think that it might depend too on, whether they're trying to reinvent the wheel. In
Mm,
other words, to do the same thing that they were doing before. And you just can't go back home sometimes. You have to go journey somewhere else that has, intrigue to it, that has excitement in and of itself. um, Exploring new avenues and new fields and new ideas and so forth.
mm,
That can help. Now, demanding perfection, as I said, is based on a belief system that demands that you perform well, or that you get the approval of others and so forth. And if you don't, it's terrible, horrible, and awful, or I'm worthless and unworthy and I can't stand it. These oftentimes these syndromes of thinking.
yeah.
So one thing is to ask oneself, am I telling myself these kinds of things? And what role models do you have, in your life, who would give you advice about what you're saying to yourself, like I failed, or I did lousy at this, so therefore I'm worthless. The people that you value, that you respect, did they ever fail? Did they ever make mistakes? And then what would they tell you?
Mm,
And what about what are you thinking, and what are you telling yourself to get yourself to this point that everything's meaningless? Are you telling yourself that it's not going to work anyway? Things are going to are really terrible, horrible, and awful. It's going to be the same old thing. I'm going to fail. What are you telling yourself? So I would have to talk more with the individual to find out exactly what their belief system is, and how they what they might be generating from it. But that being said, it's always healthy to explore new avenues and to do different things.
yeah.
So that's one thing that I would suggest as well. I have a book called "Making Peace with Imperfection," and it goes through 10 different types of perfectionism. And this individual may well be one of those individuals, to which that book can be useful.
Yeah,
Uh, and there's a lot of exercises and behavioral, exercises that could be done and so forth. So I would
definitely.
recommend taking a peek at that.
Yeah, we'll leave a link to Elliot's book in the description if anyone's interested. Our next audience question is, if someone claims to be a perfectionist in a recruitment interview, is that a red flag? Should I still employ them or not?
I would ask some more questions.
Oh,
I mean, we want to know, if this is a perfectionist in the aspirational sense, or a perfectionist in the demanding sense. So maybe asking questions like, well, what happens? Can you accept failure?
mm,
What happens if you fail? How do you relate to that?
yeah.
And if they tell you, oh, I won't accept failure, I'll never fail, I will always do the best, don't hire them.
No, yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, like I think when it comes to work interviews and even just like work your sort of requirements when you look on the job adverts, and a lot of the time it says sort of, strives for perfection or is a perfectionist or, detail orientated and all those kind of things. And yeah, it's just I think you can strive to be your best, but you have to acknowledge that your best isn't always going to be perfect. It isn't always going to be the standard that you
Mm-hmm.
often put on yourself.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So our last question is, oops, sorry, my computer's having a bit of a moment here. Um, Okay, so this last question says, I think I am probably a perfectionist, but so far it hasn't negatively affected me. Do you think with such an attitude, I am welcoming the potential negatives of perfectionism in the future?
If you're demanding perfection, then the answer is yes.
Okay.
If you're telling yourself essentially that you must achieve or you must get the approval, you must be in control, okay, and a number of other types of I must have immediate gratification. Things must always go my way. The world must always be perfect, and bad things must never happen, and the world must be neat and tidy. And if you're telling yourself stuff like that, then it's going to catch up with you
Mm,
eventually. Either your emotional or physical or both
yeah.
will suffer in the long term in all probability. So it depends. On the other hand, if you're just aiming for high standard, you have high standards, and you know that you're going to fall short, of perfection, but you're just going to shoot for the stars, as I said, and the sky's the limit, then that's okay.
Mm,
So it depends where you're at, in
yeah.
that
Yeah,
distinction
definitely.
that we made.
Yeah, so that takes us nicely into our open mic section. So, this is essentially the part of the podcast where Elliot, as the guest, gets to talk about anything that he's passionate about. Doesn't have to be related to productivity. So, I will hand it over to Elliot now. Go for it.
Well, at first, I was thinking about talking about how dogs can be excellent therapists, if you're a perfectionist. But this is
Okay.
related to perfectionism.
We love dogs, though.
But yeah, yeah, and cats. I'm not as knowledgeable about cats as I am of dogs, but I've heard some really good cat stories too from my
Okay.
clients.
We
They've
have a
been
lot of
very helpful
cats.
as well.
Lots of cats. Me and some of the other hosts in the studio. Everybody has a couple cats. I think one of the hosts, she has maybe like 4 or 5 cats. So they are well they are well loved here in the Melbourne studio. But I
Yeah,
am a dog
yeah,
person.
yeah.
I am definitely a dog person. I'm with you there.
Well, the dog really has this incredible capacity to unconditionally accept and love you.
Mm,
Say, and so you have this cheerleader, that will totally love you and accept you no matter what you say. Of course, you have to don't be bad to your dog. Be
yeah.
nice to your dog.
No, we love our
But
dogs.
right, but it doesn't matter how productive you are. The dog's still going to come to
Mm,
you and
exactly.
love you. And in fact, in one of my recent books, I acknowledged my dog in the acknowledgments itself
Oh.
for having spent many hours by my side as I wrote it without complaining once, except maybe to eat or to go out for a walk.
Yeah. Exactly.
So one thing that is very nice, if you can manage it, to get yourself, if you're a perfectionist, to get yourself a dog or a cat,
Mm,
because they make great therapists. They continue to
definitely.
accept you and love you, and you don't have to do anything like produce in order for them to love you. And I
Mm,
think it sends this message that I'm okay no matter what I do, and that's a good
exactly.
attitude to have for purposes of productivity.
Mm. No, definitely. Yeah. Do you have
Yeah,
just one dog or multiple?
I'm sort of a one dog person at a time.
Okay.
I have now a Coton de Tuileries, who's
Oh wow.
like a little white dog,
Oh, okay.
who's he's very fluffy. The Coton is. French for cotton. So he's very
Oh,
cottonist,
okay.
and he's a very very lovely personality. He's very sweet and
Oh, that's so
very
nice.
accepting. Yeah.
That's awesome.
So
Yeah,
I really adore him. And look forward, to being with him, and that's
definitely.
special.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
He was in the acknowledgements.
part of my activities actually being with my dog.
Exactly.
Uh,
Yeah.
I,
No, yeah,
yeah.
definitely. I think animals, yeah, pets just have this ability to, show you love and appreciate you. And you provide such a very, like, the bare minimum for them. You like take them outside or you feed them and you give them, like a
Hmm.
little house to live in or all that kind of stuff. And they love you unconditionally for it. I never had a dog. I love dogs, but I've never actually
Hmm.
had a dog. And I don't have cats, but I have chickens. I have like little fat
Oh,
little
okay.
fat birds. They
Well,
make like these little.
you can correct me if I'm wrong, but
Hmm.
I have a home which is a little bit more rural than my current location, and when I go there, there's a neighbor who has chickens. They have
Ah.
6 chickens that come out of a chicken coop every morning. They march back in at night,
Yeah.
and they run around. And one interesting story that happened. There was a squirrel. I've observed this squirrel who would come down and try to eat the food,
Hmm.
in the chicken, there's like a fence around it, and
Yeah.
he'd jump in, and first they chased him away, but then he came back. He was a very determined squirrel. And then after a while, they just accepted him.
Yeah.
And then he just comes in there and eats, and they're running around him, and they're like friends.
Yeah, that sounds like chickens. Yeah. I've got four girls and they're silky bantams. So they're the really, really fluffy ones with like the
Mhm,
little puffy afros. And
mhm,
yeah, they're exactly like that. They'll kind of like fend off the other birds when I sort of give them feed and that kind of thing outside. They'll fend off the other birds first because they're like, this is our food. But after a while, sort of, if those birds try to come back, they kind of end up accepting them, and just sort of
mhm,
making do with having to stand around with all these like crows and robins and all this
mhm,
kind of stuff.
mhm.
But
Yeah.
they're very like, yeah, personable animals, and I wouldn't exactly say that they're maybe as loving as dogs are. I think chickens can be a little more demanding in terms of when they want food or what they want or when they want it. They can definitely
Mhm.
be a bit more. Maybe it's just my chickens have very extreme personalities. They can be quite demanding, but it's still nice though. I
Mhm,
can go out there and sort of pick them up because they don't fly, obviously, because they're just little fat birds, and just
mhm,
sort of
mhm,
pick them up and sort of carry them around, and they don't really think anything of it, and they just kind of
mhm.
go along with it, and they're just sort of like, okay, cool, like she loves us
That's
and she
nice.
gives us food, yeah, and it's nice, and you're kind of reminded, like, when I'm studying or anything like that, I can always just take a break and go
Mhm,
outside and sort of sit with my chickens and eat with them, and
mhm,
they don't mind, they don't care what I've been doing, they're just sort of happy that I'm there and that I'm spending time with
yeah.
them, and they'll love me either way, or they might love me a little bit more if I give them food. If I don't give them food, then they're not as maybe not as
But there's
accompanying.
connections that people sometimes don't realize if they don't have these experiences, that
Mm,
animals are not, brute creatures. They're smart. They have different ways of relating emotionally
mm.
and intellectually too, in various ways.
Definitely, yeah. So I highly recommend, if for those listening, if you can get some kind of animal that, if it's possible, then give it a go. I know like lots of my friends have birds because they're much easier to keep in sort of like apartment style places, and they're just as loving, especially if you get a nice bird. If you get a nice animal that isn't like a dog or a cat, I highly recommend chickens, but you kind of have to have space to have chickens, unfortunately. But other birds, highly recommend. Anyway, we got a little bit off track here, but that brings us to the end of our podcast today. Thank you so much, Elliot, for being here. It's been such a pleasure, and we've learned so much about perfectionism and how it affects our productivity. for those who want to find out a bit more about you and what you do, where can they go?
There's a website. My website is elliotdcohen.com. And if you want to read some things that I've written about perfectionism and other areas, there's a Psychology Today blog that I do regularly,
Okay.
which is called "What Would Aristotle Do?" And
Oh,
you
fascinating.
can Google that, and I regularly publish articles,
Hmm.
post articles on Psychology Today on what would Aristotle do.
Wow, fascinating. Well, we'll leave the links to Elliot's website, his book, and all those other things in the description below. But again, thank you so much, Elliot, for being here. It's been such a pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. You have been listening to Work in Progress, the Personal Productivity Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps others find us and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at pp.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Tia Harmer. Thanks for tuning in.